The Long Island Railroad is the most frequently used commuter rail service in the entire United States, which has been serving the suburban towns of Long Island since 1834. With its long-running operations, this railroad has experienced numerous time periods throughout the overall history of America, from ownership by the Pennsylvania Railroad to bi-level cab cars running through remote parts of Long Island. Of course, even this relatively small railroad has a large amount of history which few people know of, and as a native Long Islander, I decided to bring some light upon these little-known facts of my home railroad in the Long Island Railroad Iceberg. Unofficial sticker units. What better way to start this iceberg than with some of my favorite DE and DM30ACs? This first entry of the iceberg refers to a handful of DE and DM30s which have small logos placed on their front or cab for a certain amount of time, and are considered by rail fans as unofficial sticker units. Well, at least I do anyways. These decals are usually applied by engineers who recognize the expansive history of the railroad, with some stickers lasting longer than others. The first of these units was LIRR 519, which has a Conrail logo on its right cab since 2013, followed by 511 with a Dashing Dan sticker on its right cab from 2017 to 2019, and most famously, at least on my channel, is 404's two meatball logos from late 2018 to 2019 on the front of the engine. 420 briefly having one meatball logo on its front for a month in late 2018, and 416 with its one meatball logo on its front since late 2018. Recently, LIRR 501 has been spotted in December 2020 with two LIRR keystones on each side of its cab, and since I had the first footage of this engine since its maintenance leave from February 2020, I was likely the first person to notice these heritage stickers on the engine. LIRR 503. What Long Island rail fan doesn't know the infamous story of number 503? On October 23, 2000, this engine was involved with a collision with a shopping cart in Huntington during an afternoon express run to Port Jefferson. The cart left on the tracks caught the third rail and, as many rail fans describe it, turned the cab into a thunderstorm, which severely damaged the engine. This caused 503 to sit in Morris Park as a parts unit for decades until being stripped of all useful parts in July of 2018, as it was subsequently scrapped. Since the engine was only a few months old at the time of its accident, very few photos of this engine exist in its original form, and there seems to be only one video which caught this engine in service. LIRR 507. Similar to engine 503 is another DM30AC which was taken out of service, but the story of 507 has a much happier ending. Even though 507 suffered from electrical issues which rendered the locomotive out of service around 2010, the engine was converted into a DE30AC and was renumbered to 423, with the engine still serving the LIRR to this day. Despite its conversion to a diesel-powered engine from a dual-mode engine, thus quite possibly being the only dual-mode to be downgraded to a diesel power only, there are still some remnants of its time as engine 507, such as the fuel tank remaining the same, as well as its original number being seen on the top of its cab. Metra E8s. In a somewhat similar matter pertaining to the DEs and DMs, the two Metra E8s were leased by the LIRR to haul a set of C1 passenger cars between Long Island City and Port Jefferson in 1991. These E8s were numbered 516 and 521, and only served the railroad for 2 weeks before being replaced by GP38s and were sold back to Metra. Despite them having the shortest operational history of any engines in the railroad's history, they were also the most recent occurrence of 6-axle power on Long Island, since the 3 sets of wheels per truck would usually pick the points, which made any engine with more than 4 axles relatively unpopular among drivers. Named passenger trains. Of course, everyone knows about the Cannonball running from Penn Station in Long Island City to the Hamptons during the summertime, but the LIRR once had various other named trains to destinations such as Greenport and Montauk. Named trains along the popular Montauk branch from the city to Montauk included the Hampton Express, New York Express, East Ender, Wall Street Special, and Fisherman Special. More famously was the All-Parlor Sunrise Special, along the same branch, which also carried through sleepers for the Pennsylvania Railroad, which would be attached on Pennsy trains to Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C. Other branches which saw named trains include the Main Line with the Shelter Island Express and Peconic Bay Express, and even the Port Jefferson branch with the Partridge. Train 1501. Up until its retirement in January 2021, this daily train was the only remnant of Oyster Bay electric service. Plans called for the Oyster Bay branch to be fully electrified, but work only continued up to one stop past Mineola on the main line. But that didn't stop the railroad from using the third rail to East Williston to their advantage by running electric trains one stop on the Oyster Bay branch as a terminus. As more of these electric services were cut back, the last remaining service was train number 1501, a morning rush hour service that left East Williston for Penn Station at 7:26 in the morning, but had no afternoon counterpart. Considering that it was the only scheduled electric-powered train on the Oyster Bay branch, it was a favorite among Nassau County rail fans for its unique status in history. M7 advertisements and wraps. In 2010, the LIRR placed small advertisements for optimum Wi-Fi on a handful of M7s in order to promote the new technology and to raise money for their budget. This is the first time any LIRR multiple units were given any sort of wrap, as well as the first time the railroad placed advertisements on their stock. This would happen again as part of New York State's Get Out of Town tourist incentive during the early 2010s, where a handful of M7s were fully wrapped with the advertisements promoting tourism of New York State, but these ads have since been removed. M9 Yellow Front. When the M9s were originally constructed by Kawasaki, the first set to leave the Tokyo plant were given a yellow front with no blue and yellow stripe on their side. This was the intended livery for the rail cars in order to keep with the yellow front tradition of the LIRR, but this was cancelled in favor of the current blue and white front with the large blue stripe, known as a Cuomo wrap. Interestingly enough, this yellow front M9 set was shunted through a hump yard in Chicago, which caused it to derail and gain minor damage, which caused it to stop at the Yonkers Kawasaki plant for repairs and repainting. With this in mind, there is a good chance that had this set of M9s did not derail, they would still wear their yellow front to this day. Gas turbines. During the 1960s, the Long Island Railroad was considering alternatives to electrifying their diesel branches in order to save money. One of their first ideas was to test a Bud Pioneer gas turbine railcar numbered GT1, as it was the first gas-powered railcar in the US, with test runs on the Ronkonkoma branch starting in 1966. The railcar was converted in 1969 to have a third rail chute for service in the Penn Station and was renumbered GT2, as it also had its own shed built on the Ronkonkoma Y. A few years later, a similar experiment would be carried out on 8 M1 railcars numbered 4001 to 4008. One set of 4 cars was refurbished by Garrett Air Research and the other 4 by General Electric. Both of these 4-car sets were equipped with gas-powered turbines and low-level platform doors for service on diesel branches such as the Oyster Bay branch. But these railcars were soon retired, with the Garrett set being scrapped and the GE set being converted to electric-powered M1As for Metro North. Wantagh Railroad Museum. This is a relatively little-known railroad museum consisting of the original Wantagh station along with Observation Car Jamaica. The reason why this museum is listed on the iceberg is that it is not affiliated with the Railroad Museum of Long Island, and is nestled within a bunch of suburbs, which almost makes this gem blend in with the surrounding area. MP-72s on the Staten Island Railway. Due to an ME-1 equipment shortage on the Staten Island Railway, when it was taken over by New York State, 5 LIRR MP-72s were loaned to the railroad in 1972, specifically a 3-car set with 2505, 2517, and 2546, and a 2-car set with 2509 and 2513. These loaned railcars served Staten Island for just under a year before being retired, and were likely the last self-propelled MP-72s in revenue service. P-72s in Brooklyn Army Terminal. Speaking of MP-72s, there are 2 of these unpowered passenger cars at the Brooklyn Army Terminal in Sunset Park, specifically numbers 2104 and 2103. These coaches are known as bar or generator cars, as they are equipped with diesel engines to provide head-end power for the LIRR when power units were not available. The 2 coaches were purchased by New York Cross Harbor Railroad in the mid-1980s with plans to run a dinner train within the area, but plans for this fell through and the 2 cars were stored at the former Army Terminal in 1985. Plans were then called to convert the 2 stored and now landlocked coaches into restaurants, but this plan was also called off as the 2 coaches are currently sitting in the terminal to this day, as numerous proposals for the terminals and its hidden coaches are considered and declined. Mark coaches. During the summer of 2017, The LIRR needed as many C3 coaches as possible for increased ridership on their most popular branch, the Montauk branch. In order to effectively relocate more C3 coaches to the South Fork, the LIRR leased a set of 6 recently retired Mark II single-level coaches with engines 413 and 418 for service between Long Island City and Port Jefferson for one morning and afternoon rush hour train. This was the first time single-level equipment was utilized on the branch since 1999, and these Mark II coaches have also been leased to other passenger railroads including New Jersey Transit and Amtrak. Trans-Regional Express. In 2018, the Regional Plan Association, or RPA, an agency who has been known to propose numerous service improvements for passenger rail in the New York region, announced their newest proposal known as Trans-Regional Express, or TREX. This plan proposed to merge the Long Island Railroad with Metro North and New Jersey Transit, as well as converting lesser-used branch lines into light rail service and introduce entirely new lines, such as a route from the Bronx down 3rd Avenue in Manhattan and connecting to Atlantic Terminal Brooklyn, known as the Manhattan Spine, and a loop from Hoboken to North Bergen via the Manhattan Spine, known as the Jersey Loop. Other proposals in this plan include extending the Triborough line to St. George and Staten Island, different express services on the New Haven line, and 3 different alignments to Lakehurst, New Jersey. As grand as this proposal is, there has been no direct news of the project's development since its announcement in 2018 as of when this video was made. LIRR 105. This engine already has an interesting history, as it was one of 8 SW1001s to be ordered by the LIRR for protect and switching duties in Queens, with 2 of the engines in this class being painted into the gray and orange World's Fair livery, quite possibly making these engines the first heritage units in the world. But back to 105. This engine was one of 3 which was sold to NYAR in 1997, and then the engine was sold back to the LIRR in 2016 along with 106 in a World's Fair livery once the 2 Progress Trail PR20Bs arrived. 2 years later, 105 was repainted into a very well-made bicentennial livery, possibly to celebrate the upcoming 185th anniversary of the railroad for the following year, as it received many mixed reactions by railfans. Unfortunately, the engine was repainted into the standard yellow and blue livery along with 103 due to not being the same livery as other LIRR equipment, although traces of its bicentennial livery, in addition to literally every other livery it wore, can still be seen on 105 today, or at least until its paint wears off again. Thankfully, the unit's legacy lives on in the form of a newly released O-gauge model of 105 in its bicentennial livery by Trainworld. LIRR 518. It is highly speculated that dual-mode variants of the Siemens Charger will eventually replace the DE and DM30ACs. With this in mind, DM30AC number 518 was equipped with Siemens parts to test how they would fare on the LIRR, with one of the most notable additions being an electronic Ike bell. Even though there are claims of its Siemens parts being removed, its Ike bell still remains, which makes the unit stand out when compared to other DM30ACs. Texas Longhorns Laser Train. Of the many converted M3s with orange and blue fronts which are used to melt leaves on the tracks, one of these laser trains stands out from the rest, specifically number E775. The reason why is due to its bullhorns located right below its headlights. These horns are placed specifically with an orange front laser train since it matches the colors of the Texas Longhorns, since one of the employees was from Texas and requested the modification in late 2018. Dashing Dan Clam Car. Due to their simple design, a large number of LIRR P72 coaches have been preserved on numerous tourist roads around the US. One of these is the Newport and Narragansett Bay Railroad, which purchased number 2943, who used it as a cab car for their Newport dinner train. When the route was temporarily relocated for the line's reconstruction, 2943 was retired from the dinner train and was repainted into its original 1964 World's Fair livery as it became its own restaurant in 2020, known as Dashing Dan's Clam Car. Out of all the preserved P72s, this is the only one which is painted in its original 1964 livery, or at least in a livery which looks the most similar to the World's Fair paint scheme. Furthermore, I was lucky enough to be on this railcar during its time as both the dinner train cab car and as Dashing Dan's Clam Car, thus making this railcar a perfect entry on the iceberg. Jamesport Station Remnant. Jamesport was a station along the main line, also known as the Greenport branch, which had two locations, a station house along a curve next to the bridge, and a shelter next to Washington Avenue. The original station was replaced by the shelter in 1963, and the station itself closed for good in 1984. Even though the shelter was removed, its concrete platform still remains to this day as one of two remnants of former stations on the main line, with the other one being Calverton with its shelter. P54 LIE Visitor Center. P54D number 7921 was initially saved for preservation when it was used for the Suffolk County Heritage Train along with P54 number 1900. After its time on the Heritage Train, it was moved to the Deer Park Rest Stop as a permanent display, where it remained until 2006 when it was scrapped. 7921 was offered to the Twin Forks chapter of the National Railway Historical Society for preservation, but it was turned down due to its severely dilapidated condition and was not a feasible candidate for restoration. Black River and Western 60, 1967 excursion. 12 years after the retirement of the last steam locomotive on Long Island, the island would see its first and so far only steam excursion between Jamaica and Montauk. The engine to be brought over was recently preserved Black River and Western 60, which was just retired from the Great Western Railway in Colorado, the same home as Strasburg 90, in order to raise awareness of the proposed Sag Harbor and Scuttle Hole Railroad, a proposed tourist railroad on the abandoned Sag Harbor branch operated by Ron Zeal and George Foster. Even though the proposed railroad would have operated steam engines, specifically BEDT 12 and 16, as well as plans for 60's excursions to raise funds to bring over PRRT 6 number 460, prospects for the railroad weren't presented well by Zeal, and the Long Island Railroad was hesitant on running steam engines at the time, with instructions for Engine 60 to not be under steam when in Jamaica, which resulted in a calculated stall near Massapequa when heading back to Jamaica. Black River and Western 60 is still in service today on the Black River and Western in nearby New Jersey. Now as for the Sag Harbor and Scuttle Hole, where were you during 1939 when this branch was abandoned and the tracks were still intact? And just as importantly, why not consider the Wading River branch? That's 11 miles of perfectly good right-of-way which has since been turned into a bike lane that isn't even straight. This is the perfect opportunity to run historic engines on a new tourist road and to restore a fantastic branch line which was abandoned all too soon. But I digress. Dakota Southern 213. With the reliability of an Alco diesel, it should be no surprise that a good number of LIRR C420s were sold to other freight railroads where some of them still work to this day, or have been only recently stored. One of these cases include Engine 213, which was sold to the Virginia and Maryland in 1978, and then the Dakota Southern a few years later where it was repainted into a Rock Island-inspired livery in 1993, even though it ran on ex-Milwaukee trackage. The engine was later stored in Chamberlain, South Dakota around 2014, where it along with other classic diesels sat for years until the railroad was purchased by Watco in 2021, who announced that they would not keep their stored engines. This started the preservation effort for the 213 along with other engines, with numerous plans to try to bring the C420 back to its Long Island home. Eventually, it was announced that this engine was sold to the Arkansas and Missouri Railroad, a short line which already operates a good amount of Alcos, as it was renumbered 69 where it will likely be a parts unit. Long Island preservationists are still keeping an eye on this engine, as well as other C420s, in case if the A&M would retire the engine early, which seems unlikely. Now if this engine could somehow be brought back to Long Island, then it would be a perfect engine for a proposed Wading River Branch Tourist Railroad. Intermodal service. An effective way to move trailers is to put them on flat cars, also known as intermodal rail service. However, this type of freight service is not possible in Long Island due to numerous height and weight restrictions, but that didn't stop the Long Island Railroad from innovating bogies that carry trailers at a low enough height to meet most restrictions, and connected by the trailers they carried. In October of 1988, the LIRR commenced an experimental intermodal TOFC, or trailer on flat car service from Farmingdale to Bay Ridge, where the bogies would be ferried over to Jersey City. However, these bogies were prone to derailments even when loaded, since they only had 2 axles and were limited to 20 miles per hour, with formations being limited to 15 sets. This resulted in the service being discontinued in December 1992, and the bogies sat on the abandoned Montauk Cutoff and in Bethpage, New York, until both sets were scrapped in June 2017. M1s on a New Haven line. In 1970, 4 M1s were pulled by 2 New Haven FL9s on the New Haven line for clearance and suspension tests. This was likely to test specifications for the soon-to-be-built Bud M2 for the same line, which is similar in design to the M1, but runs on overhead wires in the third rail. LIRR 167 Experimental Livery. In 2002, MP15AC number 167 was repainted into an experimental gray and blue livery while sporting both MTA logos. This unique livery would only last for a year before being repainted into the other standard blue and gray livery of the other MP15s at the time. LIRR LIE Proposal. In the MTA's first annual report issued in 1966, policymakers proposed rerouting the main line of the LIRR to run along the center median of the soon-to-be extended Long Island Expressway. The realignment would have the LIRR branch run along the expressway from Holbrook to Riverhead. At the time, the concept was feasible since the LIE terminated at exit 61 in Holbrook, and plans were in development for further extension of the route. While the expressway was eventually built to Riverhead in 1972, the LIRR was never realigned down the highway's median. Mineola Railroad Museum. While they were still up, the Railroad Museum of Long Island considered opening a Mineola location in Nassau Tower and the Mineola substation. According to their rendering, this museum would have included an MP15AC and NYR GP38 number 261 on a recreated Y behind the substation, and a caboose inside the substation. Unfortunately, both the substation and Nassau Tower were slated to be demolished in preparation of the third track, as moving either building in their current state was considered too costly. As soon as these two buildings were demolished in 2021, plans for this museum were crushed along with them. Maritime Service. Like many other railroads in the region, the LIRR provided ferry service into Manhattan over the East River from Long Island City. Yet 34th Street wasn't the only destination offered by the railroad steamships, as their acquisition of the Montauk Steamboat Company in 1898 offered destinations to Glenwood, Greenport, Sag Harbor, New London, and Block Island. Most of these ferry services are still intact today, albeit operated by different companies. Metro North equipment on Long Island. Every so often, equipment from the LIRR sister railroad, Metro North, would wander onto the island for testing certain equipment. This includes a Bud M2 for testing and repairs, an SPV 2000 for videotaping the railroad's branches in 1986, M7s to be repaired and fitted with PTC at Arch Street in 2016, M8s to inspect their third rail shoe for the shoes use on the LIRR in the same year, and New Haven FL9s for an excursion to Long Island City, Bay Ridge, and Greenport in 1987. Original M9 designs. This is referring to the original proposal from Kawasaki of the M9 railcar, which looks very similar to the existing M7s. Yet many features were eventually kept with the final design, such as the destination boards on the front of the railcar, unified front headlights, and slightly larger door windows. However, there is also another proposed sketch of the M9 which I saw at the Riverhead Railroad Museum on a poster, which I cannot find now, which included a very different front design for the M9, including an entirely black front with a yellow ring and square headlights. Original Smithstown Station exists as a house. From 1872 to 1936, the original Smithstown Station was located on the west side of Route 25 before the crossing was separated. However, once the new station was constructed and relocated, the original 1872 station house was moved to a nearby suburb not too far away from the railroad instead of being demolished, where it currently serves as a private residence. Even though the house was recently purchased by a new owner in 2021, I will keep the exact address of this station private out of respect for the homeowner. Album covers. The back cover of the 1974 debut album of BT Express, called Do It Till You're Satisfied, features an M1 pulling into Northern Avenue with the MTA logo replaced by BT Express, while the front cover features the band members on the Northern Avenue platforms. The rare will be featured on another album cover when Ohio Express featured LIRR 35 on the back of their Best Of album. Lastly, although not an album, Oscar Brand released a promotional song for the Long Island Railroad in the 1950s called All Aboard the Long Island Railroad. Leased diesels and demonstrators. Other than leasing Pennsylvania Railroad steam locomotives, the LIRR was also known for their leased GP7s, GP9s, and GP11s from the Bangor and Rostock and Precision National Corp. along with Reading RS2s, in order to make up for Alco units that were lost during a strike in 1972, due to improper storage causing their engine blocks to crack in the cold weather. Some of the railroad origins for the PNC engines included Chesapeake and Ohio, Frisco, Florida East Coast, Detroit Toledo and Ironton, and most surprisingly, Quebec North Shore and Labrador Railway. In addition, the LIRR also tested a variety of diesels when they just rolled out of the factory. This includes the FM Erie built and Trainmaster, BMD SD7, GP7, and GP35, and although not in the 40s or 50s, Leyland Pacer Railbus. Streetcars. Before the buses invaded, streetcars filled in the gaps of routes and towns that the roads didn't serve, and Long Island was no different. Somewhat unusually, the Long Island Railroad, a Class 1 railroad at the time, purchased a handful of these streetcar lines running between some of their stations. These lines include the Huntington Railroad between Huntington and Amityville along present-day Route 110, the Long Island Electric Railway and the New York and Long Island Traction Company in Queens and Brooklyn, which was jointly owned by the IRT Subway, the Nassau Electric Railroad in Brooklyn, and other lines which were pretty much limited to one town, such as the Northport Traction Company in Northport, Glen Cove Railway in Glen Cove, and Nassau County Railway in Seacliff. Battery-powered cars, 1911. Similar to the streetcar entry, the LIRR also used small battery-powered cars as early as 1911, with their first car later being sold to the Suffolk County Traction Company. Before that, it was in service on the Bushwick branch, while battery cars 2 and 4 ran on a shuttle service between Mineola and Valley Stream, as well as the Mitchell Shuttle between Mineola and Salisbury Plains, a small route which would later be served by MP41s. This goes to show that despite a plan to convert M7s into battery-powered units, battery power on the road isn't new and has been tested before, albeit during a time where battery-powered was much less reliable than it is now. Wading River to Manorville. Considering the expansion of the Smithtown and Port Jefferson Railroad to Wading River, plans were made to connect the branch line with the main line in Manorville, thus establishing the town as a three-way junction. Even though this was stated in an 1873 Atlas map, the two alignments to connect Wading River to Manorville never materialized. Nonetheless, this would still be a great connection for any heritage service on the Wading River branch in order to connect the main line and receive new equipment, but that's just my proposal. Surveillance helicopter. Due to an increase in vandalism in the late 1960s, the LIRR implemented new security measures to keep the railroad safe. One of these interesting measures was launching 2 Bell 47 G4A surveillance helicopters in 1970 to survey railroad property for any troublemakers. This operation was also shared with Penn Central, who based their helicopter in Spring Valley, New York, while the LIRR copter was based in Farmingdale at Republic Airport. Nothing else is reported of this service after 1971, and it was likely replaced with more security cameras in trains and stations. Orange and red meatball logo. At some point in the railroad's history, the LIRR created patches for different departments of the railroad's operations. Interestingly enough, the MOW department received a red and orange MTA meatball logo, thus being one of the few instances of an MTA logo which is not a shade of blue. It is unknown if any maintenance equipment or buildings wore the red and orange logo, as well as when this patch was utilized. Blue and blank front M3s. By the mid-1980s, all of Long Island's M1s and M3s were repainted with a yellow front for better visibility when compared to their original blue front, and they later received a top headlight in the early 2000s for better lighting. Yet a small amount of these units have escaped the painting shop for years, as M3 9843 and reportedly 3 other M3s retained their original blue front, even though they gained their top headlight. Even though 9843 was scrapped sometime in the 2010s, it is still considered the last M unit to have its original blue front. Although the second part of this entry may not have been for revenue service, M1 number 9755 was spotted with a blank front in 1981. This was likely taken in the midst of its repainting process, thus being an all-silver M1, but it is unknown if other units ran in service in this Silver Streak livery. Nassau County Fire Service Academy Training Cars. In addition to the pair of M1s at the Riverhead Rail Museum, there are 2 more LIRR M1s in preservation at the Nassau County Fire Service Academy in Bethpage. An interesting thing to note about these M1s is that they were likely donated in or before the early 2000s, since they both have the Meatball and Pac-Man MTA logos on their front, and more importantly, have no top headlight. Due to FRA regulations, all M1s and M3s were required to have a top headlight during the early 2000s, so these two M1s are likely the last two M1s on both the LIRR and Metro North to be preserved without the top headlight. LIST fan trips. During the 1990s, the Long Island Sunrise Trail chapter of NRHS held a number of fan trips using MP-15s and power cars into Metro North territory. This included the Dover Plains Limited in 1993, which ran from Jamaica to Dover Plains by backing up onto the Hellgate Bridge, then reversing on the New Haven line to Woodlawn, and then traveling to the then terminus of the Harlem line, as well as the LIST 30th anniversary trip to Danbury. Instead of taking the New Haven main line right to Danbury, this trip backed up to Woodlawn, took the Hudson line to Beacon, and then reversed onto the Maybrook line to Danbury, where it later met with Green Mountain 400. LIRR caboose C66 and C69 still in service. According to a recent LIRR caboose roster, caboose C66 is still in service for the LIRR maintenance trains, although it spends most of its time stored in Holborn Yard and has rarely been photographed in service. This caboose was dedicated to road conductor Sherry Hine McKenna in 2013, as her family had at least one family member working for the LIRR for about a century. At the same time, caboose C69 is still in service for the railroad, although it was supposedly taken out of service in 2016 when asbestos was found in the walls. But interestingly enough, this caboose was spotted on the work train in 2018, thus being one of the only recorded instances of a caboose in service for the railroad in the 21st century. Technically, caboose C51 is also on the roster, but it has been stored in West Babylon Yard as a storage unit for decades. Lindenhurst Station Museum. Much lesser known than most of the railroad museums on Long Island is the Lindenhurst Preservation Society Station Museum. Similar to the nearby Wantagh Preservation Society, this museum contains the former Lindenhurst Station and Freight House, along with LIRR Caboose 53, which were moved from their original site instead of being demolished during the Babylon branch elevation of the 1960s. Port Jefferson Station Relocation. In April 2017, an article was posted to the LIRR Today which proposed relocating the existing Port Jefferson Station to either the abandoned Lawrence Aviation Site or the PSCG National Grid plant. This way, the author claimed, the railroad could have more room to expand and would have more diesels away from the existing area. I have also heard that such a relocation would prevent traffic backing up on Route 112, but no news of this station relocation has developed since the article, and seems especially unlikely since the existing Port Jefferson Station has recently been refurbished. I prefer the station where it is now, since either location isn't that much closer to the village of Port Jefferson, or many of the attractions or developments along the way. And it would also sever a perfectly good connection to a Wading River Branch tourist road if one were to exist. Alright, fine, I won't bring up my proposed Heritage Road again. Road and Rail Bus. The 1960s was a time of financial turmoil for railroads and a time of success for autos and buses due to their increased range and lower costs. In order to make up for their losses, especially on lower use lines, the LIRR started their own bus service along their Greenport and Montauk branches in 1962 in order to replace some of their scheduled trains. Some of these road and rail routes were between the same destinations as their passenger trains, such as Amityville to Montauk via Montauk Highway, while other routes weren't along railroad right-of-ways, such as Huntington to Greenport via Jericho Turnpike, with connections to scheduled trains, of course. These buses were operated by the Huntington Coach Company, while the MTA eventually formed the Metropolitan Suburban Bus Authority, or MSBA, to operate these services in 1973, as this agency would later become MTA Long Island Buses and then Nice Bus. But before that, bus service became undesirable as the population of the East End increased, and after threats of abandoning little-used rail lines, the Long Island Railroad focused on its rail-based origins and discontinued its road and rail services in 1983, while adding more scheduled trains to make up for the 2 decades of bustitution. Amtrak Corridor Clipper Test Run. Boasting a population of about 3 million, Long Island is a relatively popular location for people to live and visit in the US, and it has become desirable for public transportation. With this national status in mind, it should come as no surprise that Amtrak announced its interest in service to Long Island in early 2019, specifically along the railroad's two most popular branches, Ronkonkoma and Montauk. Even though Amtrak expressed interest in these two towns, they only included proposed service to Ronkonkoma in their proposed Connexus map in 2021. In order to test the viability of service to Montauk, Amtrak inspection car Corridor Clipper was brought over to the railroad on July 7, 2021 to test the track conditions on the branch. The consists included DE38Cs 401 and 409 and a C3 behind the inspection car, which resulted in a doubleheader with the two coaches on the westbound trip to Long Island City, where the car was transferred back to Amtrak. This is the first occurrence of Amtrak equipment being brought onto Long Island, or at least past Queens, in most of the railroad's history in preparation for future Amtrak service on the island. Cobble Hill Tunnel. Also known as the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel, this structure carried Brooklyn and Jamaica Railroad passenger trains further west along Atlantic Avenue before Flatbush Avenue was a terminal, and all the way to South Ferry, Brooklyn for connecting ferry services. In order to be separated from ground level, a cut was constructed and opened in 1844 before being sealed a year later to prevent steam from spreading throughout the streets of Cobble Hill, Brooklyn. Eventually, New York legislature passed a measure which prevented locomotives in Brooklyn in general, which led to the tunnel's closure in 1859 as it was sealed off from the public 2 years later. Since then, the tunnel lay abandoned with many attempts to relocate it in the name of history and for capturing spies, but history would be made in 1980 when the tunnel was rediscovered via manhole by Robert Diamond, who later led tours of the now deemed world's oldest subway tunnel. An interesting point to note is that one of the people Diamond interviewed claimed that he fell into the tunnel right-of-way many years ago and found the abandoned remains of an 1840-built locomotive, whose current whereabouts are unknown, but this claim has yet to be proven true. Hewlett Station. Another historic railroad which makes up the present-day LIRR is the South Side Railroad on Long Island, consisting of the present-day Montauk and Far Rockaway branches. Even though these branches and right-of-ways still exist, the only physical infrastructure of this predecessor railroad is the Hewlett Station on the Far Rockaway branch built in 1869. Although the building is no longer used as a waiting room, it is still technically owned by the railroad while it's leased to a taxi company. 4 Ridgewoods. According to a list of all Long Island Railroad stations on Wikipedia, there were technically 4 Ridgewood stations on the railroad, with all except one being in different parts of the Queens town. The first one was along the Bay Ridge branch, which was renamed to Cypress Avenue, since it was opened during the same time as the other Ridgewood station on the nearby Lower Montauk branch, both of which serving exactly from 1883 to 1924. The third one lasted a bit shorter on the Evergreen branch from 1878 to 1894, and the last Ridgewood was located further along the Montauk branch and was renamed to Wantagh in 1891. Despite being the most common name among stations on the railroad, none of these Ridgewoods exist or have their original name to this day. PRR 3750, 5741, and 460 on Long Island. 3 engines which have 3 things in common. They all have historical significance, they have all ran on Long Island at one point, and they are all preserved at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania in Strasburg. 3750 is one of 2 remaining legendary Pennsylvania K4s along with 1361, and it was designated the official state steam locomotive in 1987 by the Pennsylvania General Assembly. While in service, it pulled President Warren G. Harding's funeral train in 1924 and can be found on runs to Port Jefferson, Greenport, and Montauk while on Long Island. 5741 is the only other surviving Pennsy G5, along with 35 and 39, and was even given a Long Island tender while on Long Island. Lastly, 460 was known for its record-breaking speed run, where the E6 allegedly reached a new speed record of 115 miles per hour while racing an aircraft to New York. After occasionally serving the same routes as the K4 and G5s in Long Island, 460 became the only E6 to be preserved due to its significance. Better Service for Nassau County Plan, 1963. Despite the state of decay of railroads in the 1960s, some transportation planners still developed proposals for projects which seemed outlandish at the time, and this one is no different. The main focus on this plan was around the newly opened Roosevelt Field Mall, and boy, what an emphasis on the mall they had. This plan proposed having a 4-track elevated terminal with transfers to bus, monorail, and helicopter services, and would have newly constructed branches to the main line and central branch for services east and west, both north and south of the station. And did I mention, this was also considered to be a long-distance hub for passenger trains to Washington, D.C. and Florida. And not related to the hub, this plan also wanted to loop services at Grand Central Terminal by making a left onto LIRR trackage after heading south to Grand Central. Sadly, none of these revolutionary plans came to fruition due to the railroad trying to save whatever money it had due to competition from roads, which wouldn't be helped by the huge costs of constructing a ginormous intermodal center at Roosevelt Field, equipped with new right-of-ways and nearby station renovations. LIRR operated the first diesel locomotive in the world. Although diesel engines were used for rail cars as early as the 1900s, the first diesel-powered locomotives were tested in the greater New York region in yards. Since the first one of these diesel box cabs that entered service was LIRR 401, an Alco/GE 60-ton box cab, which pulled its first train in November 1925, this makes the LIRR the first railroad to utilize diesel locomotives for revenue service in the United States, if not the world. Even though this diesel didn't replace any locomotives in Morris Park and was scrapped in 1951, it would lead the way to a kind of locomotive that would revolutionize the railroading industry and would later replace all steam on the island 30 years after its construction. Americanization School. Not much is known about this photo, other than it being taken around 1920, relatively soon after the end of World War I. The photo likely suggests that the railroad held classes in Americanization while commuting to help incoming immigrants assimilate into American living by teaching them English and civics. Despite the rising anti-immigration sentiments at the time, the Long Island Railroad still offered education and employment opportunities for those seeking a better life in the U.S. CP Rail SD40-2 to Riverhead. Every year in late August, the Riverhead Railroad Museum holds a rail festival with numerous model train displays and many years ago, visiting locomotives. Had plans been carried through, the 2001 Rail Festival would have been the most noteworthy, as New York Atlantic Railway considered transporting a CP Rail SD40-2 to Riverhead for the event. However, such a move had to be approved by the LIRR, who owned the tracks, and ultimately denied the request due to their trouble with 6-axle units, and with the SD40's fuel tanks not clearing the third rail. Yet some people did claim that the railroad was able to clear an SD40-2 to make the journey to Riverhead, but there is no known footage of this move to support this claim, which would have been the first time any Canadian Pacific equipment ventured onto Long Island. However, NYR was able to bring their leased Louisville and Indiana SW1200 number 9321 to the 2005 Rail Festival. Bombardier M7 DMU. Sometime in the late 2000s, Bombardier released a digital rendering of an M7 diesel multiple unit intended for the LIRR and Oregon Department of Transportation, most likely for WES Express. This convincing rendering included a gray front, a door in the middle instead of the two ends, and a low-level boarding door on the far end of the railcar. No orders were placed for this railcar, but it is speculated that it will be perfect for low-density branches of the railroad, such as the Greenport-Montauk branch, with rumors of this railcar being specifically proposed for the Greenport branch. Odd D 10003. During the construction of Penn Station in Manhattan, Pennsylvania Railroad engineers had to come up with an electric locomotive which would best be suited for the East and Hudson River tunnels. A total of 3 engines were built to demonstrate electric power on the middle of a track on the Central Branch, since steam wasn't allowed in the tunnels. After a series of tests, the most successful of the 3 engines was the D10003, which utilized overhead wires, meaning that the test track was the only trackage on the island to ever host overhead wires to this day. D10003 with its 440 wheel arrangement would serve as a basis for the DD1, which never ran on overhead wires, while the 2 unsuccessful units became the PRR Class AA1, where they served as switchers in Morris Park. LIRR 608. This entry is referring to an experimental livery the engine was painted into in June 1979, which only lasted a month during the Gabreski era, a time period which will be brought up later in this video. Even though this livery made 608 look like a bicentennial unit, and 3 years late for the event if that was the painter's intent, the large amount of white would make the engine hard to maintain in terms of repainting, and so the engine was repainted into the more common blue and white livery only a few months later. Mixed train excursion. Well, sort of. Although I can't find any reports of the LIRR running mixed service at any point in their history, that is, running freight with passenger cars, I was able to find a close second, boxcars in the front of P-72 coaches. But in this case, these boxcars were essentially being utilized as baggage cars to carry bikes for a 1985 American Youth Hostel's bike hike trip from Long Island City to Greenport, since the railroad itself didn't roster any baggage cars at the time. Roxy, the LIRR mascot. Long before the days of Dashing Dan and the Keystone, the Long Island Railroad was represented by Roxy, the Terrier Pit Bull mix. In 1901, a passenger handed her puppy to a railroad employee on an Oyster Bay bound train, but due to a mix-up, the owner left without Roxy, so the dog was left to roam numerous passenger trains of the railroad, where it also found a home. Dubbed the LIRR's Goodwill Ambassador, employees considered it good luck to play host with Roxy when he visited, and he befriended many commuters, as well as President Theodore Roosevelt in 1907. For the rest of his life, Roxy would roam the various branches of the system with a special travel pass on his collar that was issued by LIRR President Ralph Peters. Even though Roxy passed away in 1914, a headstone was created for him outside of Merrick Station, which still stands to this day. PA-1 and R-44 tests. I decided to combine these two entries since they both include different subway models testing on the LIRR due to their relatively expansive sections in Queens to reach high speeds. The past PA-1s tested on the railroad first in 1965, where they ran in 3-car formations after being transported from Newark via Penn State GG1s. Sometime later, starting in 1972, another New York-based subway agency would use their newest subway cars for high-speed testing on the Long Island Railroad's main line, this time being the larger New York City subway system testing their R-44, built by the same manufacturer as the PA-1. Instead of GG1s, the R-44s were shuttled to the system by IND R9s, and while testing between Jamaica and Woodside, the set of R-44s set a world subway speed record of 87.7 miles per hour, thus showcasing the promising abilities of the newest generation of subway cars. Subway connections at Atlantic Terminal. According to numerous diagrams, the LIRR had a connection with the IRT subway and also connected to the elevated BMT 5th Avenue line. The original tracks 2 and 3 once had a covered platform which connected to the IRT Eastern Parkway line for charter services, which isn't surprising considering that the LIRR intended to run service onto IRT lines, hence the subway-like design of the MP41 railcars, and that both the IRT and LIRR platforms are on the same level in the terminal. Unfortunately, this connection was removed in 1920, and the proposed connection of tracks 4, 5, and 6 to the IRT were never constructed. Meanwhile, the BMT already had a connection to the station at the Vanderbilt Avenue Yard, since the Union Elevated Railway, which would later be incorporated into the BMT, already built a connection to an elevated LIRR station named Atlantic Avenue in 1880, while the terminal was still above ground. From here, LIRR trains would run on the 5th Avenue line to 36th Street for service to Manhattan Beach, as well as Park Row over to Brooklyn Bridge. This connection was severed all the way in 1940, and the 5th Avenue elevated has since been replaced by the BMT 4th Avenue subway. Archer Avenue subway connection. Speaking of subway connections to the LIRR, the 1969 Program for Action intended on the present-day BMT Archer Avenue line to connect with the railroad from Jamaica Van Wyck Station along the commuter railroad's right-of-way to Laurelton, identified as Springfield Boulevard, along the proposed Southeast Queens line. However, even though many of the lines and transport connections proposed in the Program for Action were approved, New York City nearly went bankrupt in 1975, causing all but 2 of these projects to be cancelled due to a lack of funds. Surprisingly not listed in this subway proposal is the LIRR Atlantic Terminal branch, since the railroad has tried converting that route into a subway line numerous times due to its tight clearances and low ridership. Double-ended DM30AC EQ move. Usually when an engine has to be swapped out, an MP15AC is called a tow to broken engine, and sometimes a replacement engine if necessary, in something known as a CE move, or change of engine move. Because of these moves, DE and DM30ACs do not run light, but rather with the assistance of an MP15AC. There is one rare exception to this rule though, as on July 15, 2021, DM30ACs 512 and 514 were sent back-to-back to replace engines 517 and 415, which also moved back-to-back the next night, thus having 2 occasions of 2 DM30ACs running back-to-back with no MP15ACs within the 2 nights, with one of them also being a very rare occurrence of a DE30AC with a DM30AC. The only other event that's close to this happened a few months prior when engines 409 and 423 returned to Morris Park back-to-back after returning FRA inspection car 221. MP54 Port Washington Office Car. MP54 Combine number 1356 was retired early and had its electric trucks removed, which were replaced with non-electric trucks. With this modification, it was towed into a siding at the Port Washington station for use as an office car between 1950 and 1956 until it was eventually scrapped. Stored coaches in Calverton, 1974. Soon after they were retired, a total of 14 passenger cars were stored on the siding in Calverton intended for preservation by numerous railroads, with some of the cars later going to the Riverhead Railroad Museum. This list included 2 parlor cars which were both scrapped, an MP70 coach and B60 baggage car which are both preserved in Riverhead, 2 pink coaches which were scrapped, and only one of the 8 MP54s, specifically 4149, is preserved in Syracuse, with Combine 1391 and RPO 4209 being the most recently scrapped at Riverhead in 2006. TC80 and TC81 whereabouts. Every piece of equipment has some sort of predecessor, and in the case of the TC82, that would be the TC80 and TC81 moon rovers. Retired around the same time the DE30ACs and M7 entered service, these 2 inspection cars were acquired by SEPTA as additional engineering inspection units. Outstandingly, they still managed to keep their original paint dating back to the 1970s, albeit with SEPTA logos, with TC81 seeing more service in recent years, while TC80 remains stored. The Raunt Fam Trip. In one of the most unusual contests in Long Island's history, on Halloween of 1948, this fan trip included a freshly painted MP70 number 1294, an MP54, and flat car number 2746, which was modified with railings and seats for the trip. This trip went from Woodside via the Rockaway Beach Ranch to the Raunt station for a photo stop, which is pretty close to the present-day Broad Channel A train station, and then backed up onto the far Rockaway branch to Woodside. This is likely the only occurrence of an electric multiple unit pulling any sort of freight car within the railroad's history. PRR-L1s. During the Second World War, railroads across the nation were strained to deliver as many goods as possible to the Atlantic and Pacific fronts, so strong locomotives were required to pull heavy goods trains from vast distances. Recognizing the need on Long Island for such power, the Pennsylvania Railroad leased 11 of their Class L1282 Mikados for service on the Bay Ridge and Montauk branches. However, since most railfans were away serving their country at the time, very few photos of these engines were taken while on Long Island, and they were returned as soon as the war ended. MTA Railroad Merger. In 2002, the MTA proposed merging the LIRR and Metro North as part of a rebranding attempt for the MTA, with the most notable change being the merger of these 2 railroads. Chairman of the MTA at the time, Peter S. Calico, stated that merging the 2 railroads would streamline administrative services and result in a more uniform implementation of inventory, equipment, maintenance, and customer strategies. However, such a drastic combinations in the New York metropolitan area would have to be approved by the New York State Legislature, which they ultimately denied in 2007. Pink baggage cars. Somewhat based on the P54 coach is the B40 baggage car. Both the P54 and the B40 were constructed by the American Car Foundry, or ACF, and had a similar round shape, even though the B40s were shorter and didn't have front windows, hence why they were called pink baggage cars. These baggage cars were later converted to snow flangers, third rail cleaners, and even chloride cars on maintenance trains until their retirement in the 1960s. South Farmingdale Wigwag. Before the street was elevated from the railroad with an overpass, Broad Hollow Road in South Farmingdale was guarded by a wigwag crossing, a simple type of railroad crossing prevalent in the West Coast but almost unheard of in the East. This is likely one of few, if not the only wigwag crossing on the entire East Coast, as other types of railroad crossings with gates are more prevalent in the East. LIRR F40PH. The Long Island Railroad has primarily been an Alco railroad, in which most of their diesels are purchased from Alco. But as soon as Alco went out of business in 1969, they and other Alco railroads had to search for a new, reliable locomotive manufacturer, and that manufacturer was Electromotive Division, or EMD. Considering the success of the F40PH on intercity and commuter railroads at the time, the LIRR considered purchasing a batch of F40s for their own commuter services and numbered them 250 to 277. However, two factors made the railroad choose the new freight locomotives instead of the F40s, the height restrictions for main branches, and the P72 coaches not being compatible or necessary with the 600 series power units. If the railroad was using comet coaches like other commuter railroads, then the F40s would have been compatible. Gabreski Keystone. During the same time period as the experimental unintentional bicentennial scheme for 608, EMD Power Unit 619 was briefly given a designated Gabreski Keystone, with an entirely new redesign of the classic Long Island Keystone. Needless to say, this design wasn't approved for full use, and no other piece of rolling stock or locomotive had the logo. Lancaster Chapter NRHS Fan Trip. On May 15, 1966, Long Island witnessed one of its largest and greatest fan trips from a well-known tourist railroad from Pennsylvania. Strasburg Observation Car Paradise was attached to the back of 12 Pennsy passenger cars pulled by a GG1 with 2 stops in North Philadelphia to pick up passengers, and at Sunnyside for an engine change to 2 C420s, which took the train to Montauk. Once there, passengers explored the area for an hour and a half while the observation car was wide and placed on the opposite end, as the train later returned for Strasburg. This is the first and only time any equipment from Strasburg would visit Long Island, and technically the last time a passenger train went directly from Long Island to a destination off of the island. Wainscott Segregation. For unknown reasons, the little-known Wainscott Station had segregated waiting rooms and was likely the only segregated station in all of New York State. Wainscott's situation is particularly odd since their segregated waiting rooms goes directly against the New York State Legislature prohibition of segregation in public facilities. Once the station closed in 1938, it was moved and turned into a private beach residence, which I am unable to find an address of. Adelphi University Classroom Car. This was a very unique program which ran on major branches between 1971 and 1987, where students in the Adelphi University School of Business could take their classes in their own dedicated car while on their commute. This way, they didn't have to worry about commuting to a campus site far away from their home, but rather gained the same education while on their commute, starting from a location more convenient for them. Created by Adelphi professor Gregory Gutman and EduTrain Incorporated, classes were held in the first or last P72 and P74 coaches in the consist, which had some of their windows boarded up with plastic to keep students focused and to prevent non-students from walking in. Furthermore, most of these classes were held in the morning instead of the evening, so that students had more energy, which is one of the numerous brilliant concepts with this unique Adelphi EduTrain. Double-ended snowplow. Not much is known on these interesting snowplows other than that 2 of them were acquired in 1935 and were retired 20 years later. One of the benefits of double-ended snowplows is that they do not have to be turned around, since there is a plow on both sides, but they are pretty rare in railroading. Amtrak service to Shea Stadium. Before their Connexus proposal for service to Long Island, Amtrak did have one scheduled passenger train that ventured into Long Island. On June 14, 1997, Amtrak held a direct Albany to Shea Stadium Father's Day special consisting of 2 P32ACs and 5 Amfleets, thus being the first Amtrak service into Long Island past Sunnyside Yard. After a test run to Great Neck sometime earlier, Amtrak held a service to transport Mets fans to a Mets vs. Red Sox game where it waited at Shea Stadium until the game ended and brought the fans back to Albany. That is, fans who were disappointed that they lost 10-1 that day. GG1 in Flushing, Queens. In addition to Amtrak P32s going to Flushing, Pennsylvania GG1s have also ventured into Queens with a solid set of brand new coaches. Well, obviously the GG1 was pulled by the third rail-powered DD1s to the World's Fair in 1939 for the railroads on parade display, where it would unite with other famous engines at the time such as the S1 and the Streamline K4, just to name a few. BMT Canarsie Line connection at Bushwick Yard. From June 18 to September 21, 1924, BMT standard cars were delivered into the Canarsie Line, presently known as the L train, that went from Long Island's Bushwick Yard to Montrose Avenue Station via a ramp. This resulted in some of these subways to take part in something known as street running, or running on train tracks in the middle of the street, as they were towed from the yard into the BMT tunnels for testing. This connection has likely not been used since the delivery of the BMT standard cards, as the tunnel has since been covered up. Greenport, Rhode Island Bridge. I'm unable to find the original article for this, but a bridge was proposed from Greenport to Rhode Island in order to increase rail traffic between the two states. Not much is known about this plan, but it isn't too different from the numerous proposals which call for tunnels under the Long Island Sound to Connecticut for proposed intercity and high-speed rail service through Long Island. M5. There were supposedly plans in the early 1990s to develop a one-car variant of the M3 known as the M5, but no known concept art of this proposal exists. Some people claim that the M5 looks similar to Bombardier's original proposal of the M7 shown here, but this idea was cancelled due to Metro North already placing orders for the M6. More importantly, all of the equipment necessary to fit in one car instead of two would have reduced the car's capacity in half, which made the project undesirable. Regardless, this still would have been the first single-car multiple unit in the Metropolitan series and the first single-car EMU on the island in decades. And with that, we have reached the end of the Long Island Railroad Iceberg. Thank you all for watching this channel special, as my last iceberg focusing on American railroads was very successful, and I want to make a similar video covering the in-depth history of my home railroad. A special thanks to the Trains Are Fun and Arts Archives websites, since almost all of my information was gained from there, and both websites are linked in the video's description for more information about the LIRR. Thank you again for watching. Credit for all the photos used go to their respective photographers, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Have a good day.